Most of us have had someone in our lives we could not replace. Perhaps a parent, a partner in life, a husband, a wife, common law partner, someone very special in our life. This chapter is going to look at these relationships. Let's begin with the meaning of personal relationships. For our purposes here, and for this course on gender studies, personal relationships are those in which partners depend upon each other for various things. They range from material assistance to affection. Partners regard each other as unique individuals who cannot be replaced. For the many relationships that we form, only a very few become really personal. So when we consider about the models of relationships and the differences between masculine and feminine models of relationships, the masculine and feminine orientations to close relationships often reflect male and female approaches to relationships. There's not a lot of agreement in the research. Feminine approach is better to feminine and masculine are equally valid. So what we're going to do, we're going to explore the two primary ones to show that variation. And we're going to begin with the male deficit model. Now the male deficit model suggests that the feminine individuals are relationship experts. And they view feminine ways of forming and maintaining relationships as the right way to engage in intimacy, and that the masculine style of building and maintaining relationships isn't very good. In fact, it's inadequate. Now, the male deficit model views personal, emotional, self-disclosure as the key to close relationships. Emotional talk is seen as the most important part of intimacy. Now, it's important to note here that in sociology, and particularly looking at this area of intimacy, intimacy isn't the physical intimacy that occurs between partners. Intimacy is the emotional sharing, and it's the ability to have the dialogue between two people to share their private, most intimate moments with one another that they wouldn't necessarily share with everybody else. So intimacy has a bit of that physical element of close and proximal to one another, touching, but it's a lot about the dialogue that occurs between two people that is shared with those two people and not with anybody else. All right, so when much of the academic and the popular sentiment maintains that men, well, they're just less able than women to express emotions and to care. These approaches hold that since self-disclosure is so important to intimacy, men's and boys' friendships are less intimate than women's at least, and to girls. And that men emphasize activities to avoid intimacy. So men are more likely to be doers of things than to explore intimacy. Now that's part of this particular model. Now it's not the only model, but you'll start to see how these models of communication between men and women are different and why there might in fact be some conflict about how to communicate with one another and what is intimacy and what is a close personal relationship. Now the second model we'll look at is what's known as the alternative paths model. Now this model, it asserts that there are different routes to creating and sustaining close relationships that are equally valid for creating closeness. Already you're recognizing a difference. While this model agrees with the male deficit model that socialization is a source of the difference between men and women's close relationships, it differs in that it does not assume that masculine people lack feelings or emotional depth. And that's an important component. It's recognizing that there might be more than one route to get to the same outcome. The alternate maths model suggests that masculine socialization discourages masculine individuals from forming and expressing their feelings verbally, or limits their chances to practice emotional disclosure throughout their life. And so the alternative math model also argues that masculine people do express closeness, but they do so in a way that's different, but equally valid in terms of ways that feminine people do the same thing. This model also challenges the research that was used to justify the male deficit model, noting that these studies define and measured men's closeness using feminine ruler. Now, the feminine ruler isn't a person who covets over everybody else. The feminine ruler was a measuring stick, that the way to measure closeness was through the measurement of a feminine ruler that judged men's relationships based on a feminine norm. And so it started to explore as an alternative path that there's more than one way to get to the outcome, and that's an important statement to make. So instead of self-disclosure, masculine people tend to express closeness by doing things together. This does not mean, however, that they don't self-disclose or engage in emotional talk. And I think you'll agree, or you probably have some experience, that this shift of what is masculine and what is feminine is starting to move, where what has been acceptable for men has been changing. More men are finding ways to express themselves that are more meaningful to one another and to women. The gender of the person needing support also plays a role, since research shows that both genders tend to be more comforting to a woman seeking support than a man. And so it just seems to suggest, at least, in a stronger position, that these modes of communication, these models of communication, are blurred, that there are more alternative paths, and we're in a period of transition when it comes to gender. We're going to now look at gender styles of friendship. And it's important to note that there are many similarities between the friendships of most men and women. It's not to make this about men and women and how different they are. There's a lot of similarities when it comes to developing friendships. Both sexes value close friendships, and both sexes try to care for those relationships. Both sexes use both instrumental and expressive strategies to build and maintain their close friendships. Now, it's important to note, instrumental will be those things that you do to help one another. Expressive will be those emotional components that you use to support one another. And both men and women use both. All right, let's carry on. So now what we'll touch base on is women's friendships tend to be built, and we'll look at women's friendships first. They tend to be built through dialogue, typically about personal feelings, experiences, fears, problems, daily lives, and activities. The talk is primarily a way to build and enrich friendships that exist as a evolving dialogue. It's almost a continuation, a growth, a development of the relationship through this evolving dialogue that carries on over time. Now, because women are historically generally socialized to be attentive, to be emotionally supportive, and to be caring, it can be difficult for women friends to cope with feelings of envy and competition. Female friends often discuss the qualities and the dimensions of their relationships explicitly. In psychology, this is known as meta-communication. Meta-communication is the dialogue you have with one another about the quality of your relationship. Women are more likely to explore the qualities and dimensions of their relationships. Women's friendships are often characterized by breadth that introduces friends to many different aspects of each other's lives. They aren't very one-dimensional in relationships with one another. They're multi-dimensional and look at all aspects of each other's lives. Men's friendships, they tend to center on doing activities together, such as engaging in sports, watching games, or other shared activities. It's closeness by doing. And it describes the way many men build their friendships, going out on camping trips, doing activities together, going to concerts together, that this is the activities that men do to sort of forge relationships and friendships. Many men perceive talking as one way rather than the only or the best way to build friendships. When they do talk, they tend to be about activities. Men tend to seek companions rather than confidants in their friendships. And that's a distinction between either, both men and women, is they have different paths to get to a very similar outcome. Men's friendships, many have an instrumental focus, the doing part, in which they do things to help one another out. This is, if a guy has to make a move, he calls his friends to come over and help him make a move. That's a way of showing the support for somebody by going and helping them move. This may also take the form of diversionary activities when faced with problems rather than explicit, expressive conversations about them. A guy has some difficulties going through separation. He might go to a ball game with his buddies. This sort of bonding and sort of engagement with one another is an alternative way, a diversionary activity, alternative way to deal with that problem rather than talking explicitly and expressively about that problem. Men tend to talk indirectly about serious feelings with other men. Often serious emotional issues are shrouded in the joke talk. Just to give you an example, quite a few years ago when I was married, I was going through a divorce. I was sitting with my guy friends. We had just finished playing a baseball game. We were in the garage of a guy's place out in Walkerton. And for some reason, I started to talk about it. And then there was this momentarily, we'll call it a pregnant pause, where everyone stopped and we looked at one another and we thought, oh my God, here we are, a bunch of guys having beer after a baseball game. And here we are talking about a guy's feelings about his divorce. That quickly changed into some joking, some dialogue about the baseball game. There was an awareness that this wasn't something we normally do. It wasn't that it was bad, it was just not something we normally do in this environment. And so you can recognize that there are times when you catch yourself not doing what has been socialized to do. And I think it's an example of where this transition in gender and what dialogues can be like for both men and women is changing. So men's relationships may involve covert intimacy. Now, when we talk about covert intimacy, this is where the affection is signaled through teasing, friendly competition, playful punches as a means of demonstrating caring. So it's an important note. This isn't not caring and not expressing, it's doing it as an alternative path to the way that women might do it. Men's friendships tend to be narrower in scope than women's friendships, with the different friends for various spheres of interests. Men might have 10 different friends, of which with each one there's a certain interest that is expressed and followed, whereas women might express and follow those 10 interests with a smaller group of people. So carrying on, let's look at the friendships that can occur between men and women. And we often look at that and go, well, men and women can't be friends. Sex gets in the way. But let's look at those examples where, in fact, it doesn't get in the way and men and women can be friends. Because of the high emphasis we place on gender in our culture, women and men may see each other as in sexual terms, and even when they're not sexually involved. So for many women, the primary benefit of friendship with men is less emotionally intense relationship. They're looking at the friendship based on a shared interest, not on the emotional intimacy or intenseness of the relationship. Men report getting more emotional support and release of their friendship with women. Women also report getting more emotional support from their female friends. So both sexes report that their friendships with women are closer than they are with men. This may be why both sexes seek out their women friends in times of stress. And so there's a recognition, at least, that some of those needs can be met through friendships without there being a degree of deep intimacy. So now let's touch on the gendered romantic relationships. And we're going to look at heterosexual romantic relationships tend to be follow a very typical script in which the traditional gender roles are emphasized. But this script is changing. So when we start to develop in this heterosexual relationship, romantic intimacy, heterosexual men and women seek fairly traditional masculine and feminine partners, with men prioritizing physical attractiveness and sexiness, and women prioritizing status and success. Now, as much as that has been the traditional script, some of those scripts are certainly changing over time. It'll be curious to explore where might gender be and the gender communication approaches be in 50 more years from now. We would be a very different place. Most heterosexual couples conform to a script in which men take a more active role in planning dates. Gay men and lesbians are less likely to conform to the standard script, which makes sense. They're cutting new ground in a lot of other areas, so that script doesn't apply to them. Men actually tend to fall in love faster and harder than women. Now, men may not want to admit that, but statistically that seems to bear out. Men tend to be more active, impulsive, sexual, and fun at the beginning of a relationship. Women tend to be more pragmatic and more focused on developing a friendship. So when we look at these sort of approaches, it's not surprising that men and women don't always get along in their relationships right away. So let's touch base on attitudes towards sexual behavior. While less rigid than in the past, it's still judged that men and women we still judge men and women quite differently when it comes to sexual behavior. Women tend to be judged more harshly than men when they have sex with multiple men. We still have a stereotype for both men and women that we express when we hear the differences in terms of men and women and in sexualized behavior. Women tend to engage in sex for intimacy and for commitment reasons, while men are more often motivated by lust and physical pleasure. Women, regardless of sexual orientation, are more likely than men to focus on relationship dynamics. And partly this is a socialized perspective, that women have been socialized to care about relationship dynamics more than men. Committed heterosexual relationships tend to continue to reflect cultural values and cultural beliefs, with men as the head of the family and primary wage earner, and women primarily in charge of domestic aspects of the relationship. Now, as much as this has been changing, and statistically the data shows that it has been, this still seems to hold true in most family experiences. Gay and lesbian relationships tend to function like best friend relationships, with the added aspect of sexuality and romance. All right, now let's begin with gendered patterns in committed relationships. Now, the gender modes of expressing affection, we're going to touch on this as well. And these are the sort of models, if you will. And we'll start with women. Women tend to create and express closeness through personal, self-disclosive talk. That's an important element, whereas men are more instrumental in their displays of affection, that sort of joking side where a punch on the shoulder and a cohorting is part of that display. Women are often hurt when men don't want to discuss feelings and relationships. And men can feel like they're being pushed when women expect them to emotionally be expressive. And so it's not surprising that once we get past that sort of first introduction of the relationship, the sort of everyone's excited and the emotional high, then we find ourselves getting into the reality of the relationship and the care of the relationship. And this is where we find men and women don't always express in exactly the same way. And then it's finding our way. How will we as a couple share with one another? Now, contemporary American, or for that matter, contemporary North American culture values feminine forms of expressing care, often not recognizing instrumental displays of affection. And this has long time been a part of the dialogue, that men could go about the house doing all these activities as a way of demonstrating care and love, and women are more interested in having that expressed in the more traditional way of tell me that you love me. Showing me these things doesn't always translate well. Lesbian and gay couples, well, they have a similar expectation for modes of expressing care because of socialization into common gender norms, thus reducing some of the misunderstandings for the gay and lesbian couples. And so in spite of there being a more traditional foundation to expression, it hasn't all gone away. It is, and I've said this numerous times, it is changing over time. So we'll touch now on gendered preferences for autonomy and connection. Now, for a way of determining, autonomy is doing things in your own way. Connecting, of course, is doing things more together. Both masculine and feminine individuals desire personal freedom, and a feeling of interconnectedness is important. So a balance between being able to do things on your own and being connected to one another. Feminine individuals are socialized to focus on the relationship, generally are more comfortable with greater levels of connection. Masculine individuals, well, their socialization is towards independence, typically want greater autonomy. And so this sort of autonomy, connectedness dialogue becomes something that needs to be navigated as to what suits for each individual couple. Now, there's differences in the desire for autonomy and for the desire for connection can lead to problems in relationships when behaviors are interrupted, or are interpreted from differing perspectives. This may lead to the demand withdrawal pattern, in which one partner feels distant, so attempts to engage in close personal talk leaves the other feeling stifled by the discussion. And this is part of the transitions from friendship into personal connection and personal relationship, is finding our way and weaving our way and exploring what works for each couple. More damaging than this demand withdrawal pattern, more damaging though, is the tendency to interpret each other's behavior according to gendered rules that don't apply to the other's behavior. Respect for the different needs of autonomy and connection is essential to a successful relationship, and that's paramount. I mean, in my role as having been a counselor in terms of many relationships, one of the most common reasons for people to come to a counselor is they've stopped communicating. And so part of it is know when to be quiet, know when to listen, and weave your way, find your way into the way that works for the two of you in that close personal relationship. So now let's look at the gendered responsibility for the relational health. How do the couple look after one another in this relationship? Now, lesbian couples tend to share responsibility for the relationship. In a heterosexual relationship, well, it's assumed that women will take on the primary responsibility for relational maintenance. And that's a very traditional foundation. And we are moving through that, but we're not through it. We are still looking for ways for men to step up and become also responsible for the relationship maintenance. And these are breaking out of traditional scripts. So the expectation for one's partner's responsibility in ensuring relational health can lead to problems. The greater satisfaction has been identified in relationships where the relationship maintenance is shared. And that just makes sense. But we will find that because relationship dynamics are historical and are moving into something more contemporary, gendered power and dynamics is an important aspect in relationships. So since historically the person who makes the most money in a heterosexual relationship has tended to be given the most power. Men have traditionally been the breadwinner, and the role has afforded them with greater power in many of the relationships. Now remember, power is defined by being able to make decisions in spite of opposition. And that's an important element historically in this traditional format of breadwinner and caregiver. That's been the case. Now this has been and is shifting. And this dynamic tends not to be present in lesbian relationships, but it can cause competition of status and dominance in relationships between gay men. And we're seeing this dynamic of how does the dynamic of power influence the way that the relationship evolves changing. Tensions may arise over this role of primary breadwinner, particularly for those who subscribe to the traditional gender roles, but whose paychecks violate these expectations. What if he doesn't make as much as she does? But we're trying to adhere to the old traditional format. And so we're finding this dynamic of power in a relationship shifting. People who adhere to the traditional gender role views in marriage, but in which the woman earns more than the men, are more likely to experience decreased self-esteem, marital satisfaction than people in marriages with less adherence to the traditional gender roles. This change, by the way, has been occurring since the 1960s. And so it's been a slow adjustment, but that's part of how change occurs in any society. In heterosexual relationships, women tend to do more of the work in the home, including the housework, the caregiving, than do men. And now this is even true when both partners work, and even when the woman earns more, even considerably more, than the man. It's known as the second shift. Now the second shift is the women's duties of taking care of the home and the family after arriving home from work, and tending to be, it's very taxing, it's routine, it's repetitive, and it's not very rewarding. Now we're seeing statistically where this second shift, although still exists, we're seeing more men taking on more responsibility for the household responsibility, and that's changing, but it's still dramatically still in favor of women doing a second shift. Now the reasons why men and women engage in differing amounts of domestic labor are complex, and they include adherence to traditional gender ideology, a woman's access to relationship alternatives, and a desire for equality. Because many women consider becoming a mother to be a choice, they may assume they are responsible to meet all of the demands related to that choice. And so bringing children into the family has a big influence in terms of gender roles. Although men continue to do less domestic labor than women, men's participation in domestic sphere has increased considerably since the 1960s. But I think it's been long and slow. You can talk to your parents and your grandparents and find out about how that division of labor occurred then to see how it's different now. Now the psychological responsibility for planning and remembering things that need to be done increases the burden of the second shift duties. The psychological responsibilities of planning and organizing tend to still fall on the feminine role. Consequences of the second shift include stress, fatigue, illness, resentment. Now, heterosexual couples who share equally in running the home and raise the family are reporting to be more satisfied. When men, for lack of a better way of putting it, buy in more to those other responsibilities, they gain so much more than actually not being a part of those things. Another indicator of power dynamics is how couples manage conflict, and you can have a whole course on this, but we're just going to highlight a few points. Masculine individuals tend to use unilateral strategies to engage in and to avoid conflicts through strategies such as issuing ultimatums. You'll do it this way or we don't do it at all. Refusing to discuss issues, or to assert that the problem is being blown out of proportion. And that's the way that masculine individuals often will engage in problem solving in a relationship. Whereas feminine individuals tend to employ indirect strategies when they do engage in conflict, or they defer, or they compromise to reduce tension, oftentimes giving in, if you will. And this is falling into more traditional roles. Finding a new path takes trial and error and communication. Gendered power and power dynamics are also reflected in patterns of violence and abuse. Acts of violence tend to be inflicted most typically by men who have been socialized into masculine identities and cut across this component cuts across race, ethnicity, and class lines. Violent behavior is a product of gender, not of sex. One study reported that both male and female abusers tended to have masculine gendered orientations. Okay, what we've looked at is this element of close personal relationships and many of the different aspects that get included, and I've done a lot of emphasizing on how this is changing. It's been changing since the 60s, and it's going to continue to change. It'll be interesting to see where you take it in your close personal relationships. Carry on the good fight. Bye now.